You're listening to the God Life Culture Podcast, where faith
and what's trending
collide.
Welcome back to the latest episode of the God Life Culture Podcast. This is Eddie.
What's up, everyone? This is Miguel, and we are so thankful and excited that you are listening to the God Life Culture Podcast. If this is your first time listening, we want you to hit that subscribe button so you can be notified every time we drop a new episode. If you are a returning listener, thank you so much for coming back week after week to listen to our podcast. Take this opportunity as well, if you have some time, to look back at our previous episodes, see which ones you've missed. Catch up on those. If you haven't, listened to us and this is your first time, go back. We have a plethora of over 100 episodes that we, have for you to check out, for you to listen to, and let us know what you think. But we are here today. It is officially summer. Like we said, it is the 4th of July, right? So a lot of people are off this week. You'll probably be listening to this a day later because you're probably going to be busy barbecuing and, doing all the things, right? Swimming and all of that. So definitely hope that you enjoyed your 4th of July weekend and that you did something exciting, fun outside, saw some fireworks, went to the beach, pool, barbecue, all those things.
Yeah, or like when we said, I think it was last week or the week before, that some people don't live by like the beaches and stuff. So when you go to a little lake or your pond, that you're making the best of it. Some people go to like water reserves and like put up floaty things and like start doing those obstacle course things.
Yeah.
So regardless, at the end of the day, we're just hoping that you guys had a great weekend, had a great extended weekend. Hopefully you were off on the Monday and that you are starting your work week with us. And today we're going to be speaking about something that, believe it or not, everybody has.
Yeah.
Even the people that they, think the most highly of themselves.
Yeah. They act like they don't.
That act like they don't, or act like they've mastered their humanness.
Yes.
In one way or another. But at the end of the day, everybody, including your grandmother, has flaws. And these are things that just because of our humanness, our nature, our, upbringing and culture, and sometimes, nature versus nurture type of situations, we find ourselves with flaws that we are going to speak about today, and whether or not you should allow those things to define who you are, and how do you, when should it not define who you are, and all that other stuff. So we want to take this moment and give you the opportunity to list 3 of your flaws.
I think it's interesting because when we talk about the idea of flaws and even what you're saying, it's something that I think we find ourselves on, different, if we're on a spectrum, right? Different sides of that spectrum. There are individuals who are so open with their flaws. They're so, willing to share and be vulnerable like that. And then there are those individuals who, like we said earlier, present themselves or carry themselves in such a way where it seems like they have zero flaws. They make no mistakes. They make no errors. They are close to perfect. You know what I mean? And if something happens, it's not their fault. It's the other person's fault, or it's, the other person involved. And it seems like we have, these different, types of people who are so open with their flaws, their mistakes, and the wrong choices they make. And then we have the individuals who hide it so well and put their best foot forward at all times, where it's almost like they lack that humanity, right? Or that relatability to, man, like, do you ever mess up on something? Like, are you perfect? What is there something that you're not good at,
Yeah. And then you have the people that are in complete denial, that they're always using their flaw as a pride flag, and but swear it's not a bad thing. Yeah. And it's kind of like, you need to look in the mirror and really like reflect on, that character trait you have or that habit you have, regardless of, which one of the 2 things it is, and really understand that it's not the best thing to be proud of. And I think that that's a weird balancing act that I feel like we, especially people as Christians, especially as Latinos sometimes, of, like people of color, where we usually don't speak about like the negative stuffs in our lives, where we really do have to try to find the balance of being open about certain things while also not using it as a identification marker. So it's kind of like, like understanding that, I have a low self-esteem. But then it's also understanding, don't walk around with a cloud over you every day and use your low self-esteem as an excuse for things. So it's kind of like, be open about it, but also don't make it your whole identity. You don't have to be the Debbie Downer, moving forward for the rest of your life.
And I think when we talk about something defining you, it really makes up who you are. Yeah. Because I think, when it comes to your flaws, you have to accept your flaws. You have to recognize your flaws, acknowledge them. When you have low self-esteem, it's recognizing you may be put in situations where you're going to have to override that, and you're going to have to really come out and come through and, push through those things. But there's also, an element of recognizing your weakness, your flaws, understanding them, and again, knowing that they are a part of who you are, but they are not everything. They are not your complete person.
Yes.
So just because you have, low self-esteem doesn't mean you need to walk, every day with your head down because you have that low self-esteem.
Yes.
You know what I mean? There will have to be conscious choices and decisions that you make to not allow your flaws to, be everything of who you are. And I think that is the hard part. You know what I mean? And especially as Christians, I think, immediately when we were talking about this, I think of Paul when he writes, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. And he says, I will boast all the more gladly about my weakness so that Christ's power may rest on me, right? Yes. So it's the idea of Paul actually saying, I'm bragging about my weaknesses and I'm going to boast about it. I'm going to, let people know, but I'm doing this with the result that God's power, Christ's power, will rest on me, right? So when people see that this is my flaw and my weakness, they will also see, God's power and God's might and God's mercy and grace over my life, pulling me out of those moments or, pulling me out of that flaw. But then we have those individuals where, as believers, I think they, nurture that flaw. They take that flaw and they give it life. And everything they do, they do, whether it's in ministry, whether it's, outside of the church, in the church, they do it through the lens of that weakness, where you'll hear these individuals say, oh, well, that I have that type of personality, or that is part of my character I'm working on. And it seems like they always say these things, right? Or they'll even navigate towards having conversations about, said flaw, that flaw, and it's almost like, yes, it is healthy to recognize it. Yes, it is healthy to talk about it. It's great to, have conversations and have dialogue on all of these things. But now, is it healthy to look at everything in your life through the lens of your flaws?
Yeah. And I think that there's certain flaws that are also not really flaws, but things that people make flaws because of maybe they haven't achieved certain benchmarks in life. So you have people who maybe, are of a certain age and really haven't solidified a career. So then they maybe like identify themselves as someone who is a loser, or someone who, is wasting their life away. You have people who reach a certain age and are not in a relationship. So all of a sudden that becomes their identity. There's someone who is living single forever, and, and then that becomes this whole other thing. We've spoken about this in Sunday school a couple of times ago, already in the last couple of weeks, where, like sometimes we allow certain things to become our identity because we are really trying to act like we're not ashamed of it. So it's kind of like you feel that you're supposed to be with someone, for example, but you find that you're not with someone. So now all of a sudden you're this strong, powerful man who doesn't need a woman. I could be 53 and single, and it's not a bad thing, which for those 53-year-olds out there that are single, it's not. But when you make it your identity, that now everything you do and everything you talk about and everything you see is through a lens of someone who's trying to not be bitter about that quote unquote flaw that they have, that's when that becomes a problem.
Yeah. And I was listening to, this individual speak on something very similar. And, she's in her 40s and she's single. She's a podcaster. She teaches, does many different things. And she was saying that for a long time, she made it, I guess, clear to those around her, right, that she did not want to be the face of the single women's ministry, right? That she didn't want it to be, when people thought of, people who are single and that are women, that she's the first person that you think of, because she goes around parading her singleness. She goes around talking about it all the time. She goes around doing conferences to single women and how to, live and be single and content, right? And she said that although this is a big part of her life, it is not everything. And she doesn't want to be defined by this one area in her life. So she talks about it and she's open about it, but consciously she makes this effort for it to not be the forefront of every conversation, of every speaking engagement, of every podcast, of every interaction she has with someone. She's bringing up the fact that she's single, right? And again, that is a wise choice to make. Are there individuals who may want to be the poster child for something or may want to be the face of something? Of course. And that's your choice, your decision to do that. But then there are those individuals where it's like, I don't want to go around parading this issue in my life. Mind you, being single is not a flaw, right?
No, it's not.
But there are things that are attached to it, right? Such as for some individuals, it can be sadness. It can be, discontentment, being unsatisfied, all these different things that can come up as a result of that, So I think you have to be careful when you choose to boast about your weaknesses, boast about your flaws, and make sure, again, the motivation behind it is correct. Make sure that whatever you do, you are doing it with a clear purpose in mind. Yeah. You know what I mean? That it's not like I'm doing this because this is how I cope with it, right? And I remember that when we had Priscilla, on with us a few, episodes ago, she spoke about that, how there are, preachers and teachers that, as they're preaching and stuff, they'll say that that's their therapy and that that's their way of coping with things and all of that. And, situations like that, you just have to be very careful with, you know what I mean? Where you take a flaw or weakness and then you work in that area so much and you're surrounded by it and you're doing all these different things surrounding that issue, but you're not really, getting better, or you're not really growing, or you're not really getting out of that. And then it's also the flip side where you're so involved with it and it becomes who you are, becomes your identity, becomes the foundation of your ministry, of your conversations, of your talks. You are single. Let's say we're going with single and, you battle with some of the emotions that come along with that, right? Or you're someone that struggles with anxiety and, you struggle with the feelings and the emotions that come with that. So all of your friends are all individuals who struggle with anxiety. You all talk about it, send each other videos, you know what I mean? Then when you do something within your church, it's anxiety driven, right? That's kind of what you're talking about, or the focus. What happens the day that you no longer have anxiety, where you feel like you really worked at it and now you don't have it anymore? What happens the day that now you go from being single all these years to now you're married, right? It's like, does that foundation or that identity of who you are, will you be able to still talk to individuals? Will you still be able to function within ministry and in conversation with individuals? So just being careful that once that flaw is kind of no longer there or prevalent in your life, who are you then as a person? And
I think that that's an issue that a lot of people have, regardless of flaws. People can do the exact same thing with achievements, where they allow one thing to be their identification marker. So it's kind of like, what happens to the single person who spent all these years speaking about singleness and became the poster boy or girl for that, and all of a sudden gets married? Now they have to find a new identity. So now maybe the only thing they talk about is marriage, and then they become a parent. Then the only thing they're talking about is parenthood. And it's kind of like this one dimensional facet of themselves that they are only able, or have only developed the ability and capability to only present themselves as one thing, when in reality, as humans, we're multifaceted. You can be someone who's a parent, who's a husband, who's a wife, who also likes sports, or who's also really heavily involved in ministry, or who's an artist, who's a dancer, who's a preacher, who's a this. We are multifaceted people, and we should be able to present all those things to a conversation, to a table, to a meeting, to anybody. But when you're someone who only focuses on that one thing, whether good or bad, you're selling yourself short, because you're not being able to present yourself the best you that is possible. There's a lot of different hats that there's a lot of tools, as if you want to say it, that we acquire in life that we keep adding to our belt, because depending on the situation or what's going on in the moment, you got to pull one of those. You can't unscrew a screw with a different tool. Like, it has to be a screwdriver. You can try to hammer down a nail with a shoe. It may work, maybe it won't, but you really do need a hammer or something of that, magnitude to do it. So that's why it's important that we don't allow our flaws to be our identification markers, because what happens when God restores that flaw? Even before that, how do you even get to a place where you can be okay with either God restoring that flaw in you, or getting into a better place where that doesn't identify who you are? And I think that the first step for that is really, it takes a moment of humbleness to really identify, this is a problem for me. Maybe I'm someone who's very arrogant. Like, I think I am the last, like you say in Spanish, la última Coca-Cola del desierto, where you kind of think like, I'm the shiitake mushroom. That's me. Like, I'm the crazy one, you know, like nobody could do it better than me. Nobody could do this if it's not like, or whatever. And it's like, sometimes you got to step back and be like, Lord, you know what? There's a difference between confidence and arrogance. And I think I'm really leaning more towards the arrogance, and I need you to work in my heart. That, you know, not everybody has the ability to step back and realize that they're arrogant. Same thing with jealousy. There's some people that suffer with jealousy. They're the biggest haters out there, but cannot identify that about themselves. And you really sometimes have to take a step back and be like, you know what? I'm a hater. You know, that's a hard pill to swallow, but you have a flaw. Your character flaw, your personality flaw is that you're someone who's very jealous, can't find contentment in the things that they have. You know, some people are greedy. Some people have issues with lust and vanity. Like, you can go down. I have a whole list of stuff here. There's people that are hypocritical. There's people that are gullible. There's people that's egotistical. There's people that are just ignorant, lazy, messy. People that are always nervous. Have you ever met someone who's like always nervous, or is like, why are you so jittery? Like,
Right.
We're waiting for the movie to start. Calm down. You know, so I think the first step really is to like eat a little bit of humble pie and be like, okay, I'm not perfect. I have an issue. And now you present that to God. Like, all right, Lord, now I really need you to help me with this thing.
And I think that's always the first step, acknowledgement, right? Recognizing that this is even an issue. And I think a lot of it is because we are groomed or taught from young that we always put our best foot forward. You know what I mean? That you don't let no one see those things or that side of you. And, you know, and I think especially within the church and as believers and as Christians, I think it's even more prevalent there where you are taught that, you know, those are things you don't talk about or you don't let people see that, or you put yourself together. And although there are moments where that is the case, I think there are also moments where people need to see your flaw. And people need to see that weak moment, you know what I mean? And obviously, you know, in inappropriateness and not being like, you know, crazy with that. But, you know, I think of the preachers and teachers that I listen to that, you know, I am engaged when they listen. I get a lot out of it. And a lot of it has to do with their transparency and their authenticity about what they're talking about. So if you're giving this whole message, you know, on anger, and you're preaching on anger or, you know, discontentment, like, is that something you've struggled with in your life? Like, do you have a story that's connected to that? You know what I mean? And I think when the preacher, teacher, person speaking presents everything in such a way like they've never struggled with this is never a thing for them, like, and they have all the answers, it's very hard to really connect with someone that seems to be talking from a place where they have all the answers. And I think as Christians and as believers, and we've spoken about this before, where we will talk about, you know, the process a lot of times after the fact. We'll talk about the big miracle that occurred when it's occurred. We'll talk about what God did when God did it. But very rarely do we talk about it when we are in the middle of it. When we are in the middle of, you know, looking for a house and can't find one. When we're in the middle of trying to have a child and can't. We're in the middle of trying to, you know, get over our depression and anxiety and it's getting worse. We don't talk from that perspective. You know what I mean? Or from that place, where I think it's very important to make an effort to speak from that place and, you know, create art from that place and do things where we let people know, not after the fact, right? Because people know God can do it. They've seen, you know, they've heard your testimony. They've heard what you've said. They've, you know, seen the videos, right? But what was it like when God wasn't answering you? What was it like when, you know, you were praying about this flaw of yours and it seemed like you were just hurting more and more people? You know, what was that like? What was it like when people were, you know, expressing their flaws to you and you didn't know how to handle it? You know what I mean? So I think a lot of times we need to kind of learn how to speak from that place as well, where we bring people along for the journey. You know what I mean? And then when that happens and when there is that breakthrough, when there is that miraculous moment, you know what I mean? People also appreciate it a little bit more. And they're like, man, I remember when you said this. I remember when you shared about that and that weak moment and that moment where it was very difficult, you know, to move forward and to walk, and you did it anyway, and look at now. You know what I mean? I feel like that's a moment where it's even more powerful when people know the journey.
Yeah, and I think it makes it less superstitious. If you just, if you're preaching or you're sharing your testimony and you're like, yeah, I was struggling financially, and then God, all of a sudden gave me 3 new jobs, a mansion, and a this and a that. It's kind of like, yeah, he can do it, but that's mad weird. Like, I don't like it. Like, it doesn't seem realistic.
Yeah, like sometimes.
But
yeah,
if you were to go and be like, there was a time where I was struggling financially, and I tried to do this, and I was feeling that, and we went through this. I mean, whatever. You take the person through the whole journey, and then at the end, when God does the miracle, whatever it is, you got a new job, you got a random check in the mail, the IRS returned some money because you overpaid your taxes. I don't know, something like that happens. Then it's kind of like, wow, that's crazy. Why? Because they may not identify. The person listening may not be able to identify with a random check coming in the mail or with a new job just falling on their lap, but they'll identify with the struggle because even though everybody's journey is different, at the end of the day, those emotions and those feelings are all the same. And I think about how sometimes we as humans, because of our humanity, we kind of make certain things that are positive about ourselves into flaws, and one of the things that came up to my mind was that I've always found myself, especially when I was a lot younger. Now it's kind of evened out. But back in the day, I always found myself to be the youngest person in the room. So it was one of those things where you were always, whether it was a leadership meeting, whether it was a work thing, whether whatever, I was always the youngest person in the room. And I saw that as a flaw. So it was even times where I was supposed to be addressing the room and I was supposed to be the person leading the meetings and stuff like that. And I would always start, I know I'm the youngest person in the room and whatever. And that was the identification marker that I always started with about being the youngest person in the room. And I used it as a negative thing for a really long time. And sometimes it's like, that's not a negative thing. That's a good thing, that you're placed in a position where everybody else is older than you. Everybody else has more experience than you, but you're still at the same caliber, if not better, because that's the truth, than they are. So walk in that. Be able to stand in that, knowing that God placed you there for a reason. And sometimes we find ourselves where God puts us in positions or God gives us certain gifts or certain opportunities that instead of looking at it as a positive thing, we're looking at it from a negative perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I could absolutely agree to that and relate to that. I think also for me, it was that a lot of my friends were older, right? So it was like the people around me, my age, it was like, I didn't really have a lot of friends around, like my age, you know what I mean? So I think that was also another thing. And it was like, how is it that I can carry a conversation? I'm 16, I'm carrying conversation with, a 22-year-old, and it's like, we can, how is that possible? But it's a level of maturity that I guess at 16, right? Where at that age, I always found myself to be like, maybe a little weird or like, like the outcast from certain groups of people my age because I just thought differently. You know what I mean? At that time, it was a flaw in my opinion. And I was very much like, okay, I need to like, maybe do this or do that. And so I don't want to use this phrase, but it's almost like dumb things down.
Yes.
So then you could be at like a certain level with people around your age or, people in your circle for whatever reason.
Or insert like a level of obliviousness about certain things just so that you're not always the one standing out with the opinion.
Right.
Or the strong, notes to give out.
Yeah.
So.
And again, I think like you said, there are things that we may perceive as flaws, but they aren't really flaws.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And I think you have to recognize that. Is this something that is truly a flaw? Is this hindering me? Is this, interfering with my relationship with God? Is this, a struggle for me? Or is this just a different quality of mine that I haven't fully tapped into or I haven't fully become comfortable in, that it just needs work and development and time? And sometimes that's what it is. Time will, help you identify, well, is this actually a flaw or is this the way you are looking at this quality that you have? We have a way as humans to self-sabotage, right?
Very true.
Great characteristics and great qualities that we may have because we think it's a negative or because people don't understand it, right? But then there's in that same wave, you have to also recognize where you may think you may have a great quality or you may think that, your outgoingness is, one of your character highlights and everyone around you may not think that, right?
True.
And it may be the truth is that your outgoingness can sometimes be a little abrupt and intrusive, right? So it's having to navigate and be honest, like you said earlier, with yourself to know, this quality of mine can be a great quality,
yes,
right? I'm not using it correctly, right? I'm not navigating this trait of mine correctly the way I should.
Yeah.
And this is where the help of individuals around you, people you trust, spouses sometimes, friends at times, that can really help you and identify, listen, it comes across this way, and that's not cool.
Yes.
Maybe all you have to do is work on the delivery. Maybe all you have to do is change your tone. Maybe all you have to do is change how you carry yourself in that moment. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
But definitely it takes that honesty to recognize, okay, is this really a flaw? Am I trying to convince myself it's not a flaw, but it is? What is it?
Yeah, and I think about, like, one of the things that sticks out for me personally is my outspokenness. How for a really long time I thought it was a good thing. And it was like, well, I'm just going to say it and it's going to be what it is because I speak the truth. You go through that phase type of a situation. But then there comes a moment where you do have to, like, look at yourself in the mirror. Like I said, humble yourself and be like, you know what? It is true. I think sometimes I'm a little bit too opinionated, or sometimes I'm a little too outspoken. Like, did you really have to say that? No, it didn't. Like, you felt good in the moment for saying it, but was it necessary? Did it contribute any positivity to whatever was going on? It's kind of like, nah, I really didn't. So, so you humble yourself and then you have to be, like, honest with yourself also. Take responsibility for your actions. In those moments where I was maybe too outspoken or I gave an opinion that wasn't really necessary or whatever, like, I have to be like, you know what? I did that. I didn't have to. I should not have done that. I should have just stayed quiet. It would have, erased 45 minutes from this meeting because that one thing I said spiraled into something else or whatever. And it's kind of like you take responsibility. At first you humble yourself, then you take responsibility for your actions and understand, yes, I do have a problem. I should be able to focus that and maybe channel it. Like you said, there are times where it is great to be outspoken. There are times where it's great to have an opinion, especially if it's different than what everybody else is doing. But then now you have to really navigate that balancing act of when is it an opportunity to be outspoken, and when is it sometimes an opportunity for you to reserve yourself. And you have to be honest with yourself. You're honest with God. You bring that to him, and then you open yourself up to allow God to then work in those areas in your life. So maybe if you're someone who's working on being outspoken, on being a little less outspoken, then God will put you in situations where you're going to want to say something, but you shouldn't. And then there's also the opposite. If you're someone who is working on maybe finding your strong voice, then God is going to put you in situations where you need to use your strong voice. So go ahead and give that opinion. Go ahead and give that observation. Go ahead and give that idea. But you really have to be, it's like you, in a very obvious but weird way, you need to be really sensitive to God and the Holy Spirit and his voice to know when is it that you turn it on and when do you turn it off.
Yeah, and I'm glad you said about the opposite or the flip side, because I think oftentimes when we say outgoing, that can be more related as a negative thing and categorized as that. But when then we look at the individual who doesn't speak up enough or doesn't say certain things or express themselves, it's almost looked at as humility, right? Where both individuals, if not channeled correctly or use that trait correctly, can be a flaw, right? Where you can be so humble and so laid back, where you feel like you can't speak, can't say that, can't share your opinion, can't express yourself, and then that also negatively affects you. And then there are ideas that aren't presented that should have been. There are things that maybe could have progressed and grown, but because you didn't share your thoughts and opinions, it didn't, right? So there are negative effects on both sides. So again, when we look at something that's an obvious flaw, it's okay, yes, that's an obvious flaw, but what are the flaws that are not so obvious? You know what I mean? And the way that you think about yourself and the way you talk to yourself or speak to yourself. There are people that won't say a negative word about another person, but they talk to themselves and look at themselves in the most horrible way, in a degrading way, in a way where they don't respect themselves, or they don't, have the confidence in themselves. They don't speak to themselves, about how they're able to accomplish things, and everything's very negative about themselves. They can turn around and say that they're not negative towards other people. They don't, hurt other people, but in turn they're hurting themselves.
Very true.
So I think you have to, almost look and see, and this is where you say it comes with prayer and asking God, reveal to me, those flaws that I have or those weaknesses that I have that I don't even know are weaknesses or flaws. Let me know what are those areas where, I'm not looking at, or I'm not focused in, and I'm not, looking at its negative effects and how it's, bringing me down or how it's bringing others down. Because it's quite possible that we have flaws in life, in our own, day-to-day interactions with individuals, that we don't realize how we're hurting them, or we don't realize how we're hurting ourselves, or we don't realize the negative effects our actions are having. And that is where we need God. You know what I mean? There are things that we can't see. There are things that other people can see and let you know. But then there are things that literally no one sees but God. And really, he has a way of letting you know. And like you said, he'll put you in situations where, you want to speak and you want to say something, or you want to lash back, or you want to react in anger, or in situations where, it could easily be like, this is your moment where you get real discouraged, real down, real disappointed, and depression starts kicking in. And it's almost like that is the moment to fight. That is the moment to try to rise above. That is the moment to try to overcome that obstacle that's going to kind of bring that flaw back to the forefront in your life. No,
very true. And I mean, listen, we're two individuals that are sitting here speaking on this subject, not from the perspective of people that have mastered their flaws. We're two people that acknowledge we have flaws, we have things to work on. There are things that we have, figured out, and then there's other things that we haven't. It's like you said, sometimes there's things that we need to work on that we don't even realize that we have to work on. But at the end of the day, the important thing is to have a mindset where you're willing to work on those things. Don't resign yourself to the idea, well, I've been like this for, 40 years. It's just going to stay like that. Oh, I've been like that for 18 years. It's just going to stay like that. It's kind of like, no, every day is a new opportunity to be better. Every day is a new opportunity to get closer to God. Every day is a new opportunity to get smarter, to get wiser, to get stronger, to be more creative. And it's also another opportunity for you to work on those flaws that each and every one of us have.
And with that being said, we hope that you have enjoyed this episode and that, you work out your flaws, that you work at it with the Lord and help, have him help you overcome those things. And, with people around you, I think a lot of times, if you talk to people, they'll tell you, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And if you have that relationship and connection with them,
just don't go to anybody.
Right.
Don't go
These
to
are the people that your circle of people, you know what I mean? That will be honest with you.
In a loving way.
In a loving way, and where then you can be honest back with them.
Right. Like, first of all.
But thank you so much for tuning in to today's episode. Again, if you are not subscribed, be sure to subscribe. Stay tuned for our new episodes that we release weekly. Follow us on Facebook and Instagram at God Life Culture Podcast. If you are listening to us on Apple or Spotify, you can check us out on YouTube and subscribe to us on there at God Life Culture Podcast, and check out all of our visuals for our episodes.
Yes, so you know what? Walk away with the idea that you're not going to allow your flaws to identify who you are and what your life is supposed to be. So thank you once again for tuning into today's episode of the God Life Culture Podcast. That's God Life Culture. Until next time.
See ya.
Bye.